So, welcome to the Psychosocial. I think this is the 5th episode. I could be wrong, but either way, we're here in London with really exciting guest. This podcast was really something that I thought of, which was, I know lots of interesting people in this field of trauma, adversity and resilience and mental health. And I figured the best way to kind of get some of those important ideas out there was to invite people to have conversations. So here we are. My name is Warren Larkin. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist and managing director at Warren Larkin Associates. And I've worked with people who've been impacted by trauma for about 30 years. And today it's really exciting that I'm joined by Sir Norman Lamb. Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for coming all the way from Norfolk.
It's a pleasure. It's not as far as you.
Well, yeah. We both arrived a little bit hot and sweaty.
Yeah.
Me not being used to the temperate weather of
the heat of the south.
Yeah. So I'll say a bit about Sir Norman's background before we launch into the questions. So Sir Norman is a mental health campaigner. I think that's how we all know you. But before that, and at the same time, actually, you were a Liberal Democrat MP.
Yeah.
Member of Parliament for North Norfolk,
Yep.
2001 to 2019.
Perfect.
So you did your stint in public service
Yeah.
there. Then Minister of State for Care and Support at the Department of Health from 2012 to 2015,
Yep.
which is when we met. And then you went on to be chair of South London and Maudsley NHS Trust.
I should just mention I was also chair of the Science and Technology Select Committee between 2017 and 19.
Yes.
And we actually did an inquiry into evidence-based interventions in early years. So I got
Wonderful.
mental health onto the agenda of the
Brilliant.
Science and Technology Committee, I think for the first time.
And that was a big event. I remember lots of people that I knew providing evidence and
Sure.
information.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I remember coming to visit you at Portcullis House
Yeah.
to talk about it.
Yeah,
And so you were chair of South London and Maudsley.
I was.
And
5 years.
a specialist mental health trust for 5 years. And then you received your knighthood for services to mental health.
Yeah, back in 2019.
2019.
Yeah.
And well deserved, absolutely.
Well, I don't know about that, but
Well,
I mean, it was good
fitted.
to receive it. It was,
I think so.
It was appreciated. But
Yeah. Well, I think it was a fitting recognition of what you did.
Thank you.
Personally, I was delighted when I saw that.
Kind of you.
Well, no. So I always start by asking people a little bit about their formative years, their childhood.
Sure.
Pretty basic play for a psychologist, obviously.
Sure.
So what?
Nothing to be too nervous about.
No, nothing at all. Don't worry. I'm not analysing you. But there is something about how do people become who they are? You know, how do they get
Of course.
where they got and what drove them to be the person that they are? And actually, you know, I think both of us know that a lot of that is our childhood's really important.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in your growing up, the experiences that were kind of important in your life that influenced you, the people that influenced you. So just to give us a sense of how you progress through life and the things that might be important.
Yeah. So I was born into a family that was, I suppose, quite high achieving. So I had a dad who became a professor of climatology and set up something called the Climatic Research Unit at the University of East Anglia, which is why we moved to Norwich.
Okay.
But his dad had been a professor of engineering.
Wow.
And his dad had been a professor of mathematics.
Amazing.
Published books and so forth. And on my mother's side, high-achieving lawyer in Scotland. So that's the sort of setting. I had two older sisters, both themselves quite high-achieving, both head girls of their schools. And then there was me. And
No pressure then?
No pressure.
Not at all.
And I don't think that much was expected of me, actually. I failed my 11 plus.
Oh.
And I think my mother in particular was sort of close to despair about worrying about what I was going to do when I grew up, as it were. I wasn't that bothered. I was into football. We moved to Norfolk when I was 14. I got into a grammar school. They'd already moved to comprehensive in Surrey, where we used to live. But because I'd been in the top stream of people who'd mostly failed the 11 plus, I ended up getting into a grammar school in Norfolk. But I didn't do particularly well. I certainly didn't do well at GCSEs or A levels. I got into
university.
university.
Then would it have been known?
You know what? Sorry, yeah, you've caught me there.
Well, I'm a
dodgy politician.
I just did the last one. Yeah,
yeah.
O levels.
So I got into university through clearing. This is not a high achievement at all, and I suppose it was getting into university where I suppose I started to get my act together. I've been most interested in art in the sixth form. I'd done an art A level, and that's where I spent most of my time. And I didn't focus particularly on the academic subjects. Failed my maths A level, but I got into Leicester through clearing to do social sciences. After a year of that, I sort of explored whether I could transfer to law, because I did some work experience with a law firm in Norwich, found it quite interesting. It was a friend who worked there, and I got into law, provided I got a 2-1 in my first year. So I then transferred to law, and it was in those days, unbelievably, I got an extra year's funding for a fourth year at university, and ended up with a 2-1 degree in law, and whilst I was in my final year doing law, I got a letter from one of the local MPs, a guy called Greville Janner, who later became a bit notorious because there was a police investigation into historic child sex abuse allegations, and it was quite a story at the time in the national press because a decision was made by the Crown Prosecution Service not to prosecute him because he had dementia by then, and then subsequently died. So we never get to know what happened, and so there were a load of people who may be victims of that, of those alleged actions, but we simply don't know. And there's nothing in the time I worked for him that would lead me to believe he'd committed offences. But it meant he was writing to me as the president of the University Law Society to ask whether I would advertise for a parliamentary assistant for the next year.
Okay.
So I put it on the notice board, but applied myself straight away because I was really interested in politics, and got the job, and spent a year in Westminster. And so this
that was fascinating.
This was totally fascinating, and it made me feel I want to get here, but I want to get here on my own terms based on, he was a Labour MP.
Okay.
But there were things that I believe very strongly, and so I wanted to do it on the basis of what I believed, which wasn't necessarily easy because I was a sort of liberal, and there weren't many liberal seats in Parliament, so that was an uphill struggle. So I suppose I started to, through university and then subsequently, I guess I became quite a grafter, and I would never claim brilliance, but I worked very hard and learnt a lot as I went along, and I suppose it was a sort of Protestant work ethic in a way, and I suppose there's also a little bit of wanting to prove people wrong because, not that much had been expected of me as the sort of youngest child of these two very high achieving older sisters.
I like you even more now because all of this didn't come easy to you, and I relate to the whole education being a bit of a bumpy ride. Yeah, and then getting to university and thinking, right, I've really got to get my head down and get through this, but it not being a breeze. Yeah. And actually I think some of the most successful people that I've met, it's not been plain sailing. They've had
graft,
to manage the slings and arrows and work their ass off to get where they wanted to get. So fascinating. What was it about observing working with a politician that made you think, do you know what, this is for me? What was the thing? Was there something in particular made you think?
So I suppose I came from a family that was interested in politics. We talk about politics, round dinner table or whatever. My parents were both liberals, but were not involved in any way.
Okay.
I think my dad had reacted very strongly to a sort of very conservative, traditional father, and he was a Quaker and a pacifist, and so, I mean, he was working for the meteorological office as the Second World War started, and he was asked to do weather forecasting for experimentation with chemical weapons, and he said, "I can't do that," and so he actually was a sort of conscientious objector and went to work in Ireland during the war and did the forecasting for the first seaplanes that flew across the Atlantic to the States. But that was the sort of context of me growing up.
Okay.
So I sort of, as a teenager, and I suppose this in itself is a little bit quirky or bizarre, but I was very interested in politics. I set up a sort of young liberal group in my high school in Norfolk. I canvassed, knocked on doors in a general election at the age of 15.
That's impressive. I mean, to know what you believe at that age so clearly, that you could knock on someone's door, is quite something, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I don't want to overstate it. How much I developed my thinking, I don't really know. Broadly, I knew what I stood for.
You had some conviction, though, to knock on people's doors and talk to them about your beliefs.
I guess so. Yeah, and I did have a sort of sense that I would love to do this job of being a member of Parliament, because I sort of felt this was a way that you could achieve things. You could get things done, based on what you believe in.
Yeah.
And it's there's a very negative public view of politicians. I think it's probably the case that quite a lot of people go into politics initially with good intent, whatever their sort of political leanings happen to be. I think quite often people get diverted when they're there in the sort of pursuit of power, or because you're sort of forced. You're frequently forced as a politician to make quite difficult judgments. There may be something that you don't really believe in, but your party's asking you to vote for
Team
it.
effort, yeah.
This is the sort of, parliamentary whipping system. And that is really difficult. And some people take to that easily and just sort of, just become loyal party people who don't think too much about whether it's something they believe in or not.
They just support the cause. Yeah.
Other people struggle with it. And there's a legitimate tension here, because I understand that a party, say in government, which we rather unexpectedly ended up being, very unpopularly at the time, but you do have to have some discipline. It's chaotic if everybody's going in different directions, and you can't get anything done, and that winds the public up, as well as other aspects of political life. So there is a genuine tension between the need for some discipline to achieve things and respecting people's deeply held convictions.
Absolutely. And fascinatingly, though, because you studied law, you got a degree in law, and you went on to practice law.
Yep.
And you had this, so you had already had this kind of political aspirations sort of fermenting, but you went on to practice as a lawyer, and were very successful in doing that. And you told me a little bit about the book that you wrote and the campaign you did for the women in the armed forces. There's a lot of overlap, isn't there, between the advocacy work you did in your legal practice and the kind of desire to become a political animal and be a member of Parliament.
There has been a bit of a sort of common thread in a way, being people's advocate. So when you're a lawyer, and I'm not trying to claim I was some amazing campaigning lawyer who only represented the dispossessed, as it were.
Yeah.
I did work for both claimants and for employers.
Okay.
But there were plenty of cases where there were people who really did need a voice, and your job is to give them that voice in tribunal. I happen to specialise ultimately in employment law, as you said. And then, as a member of parliament, I think if you're doing your job properly, you are absolutely the advocate for people, and you get a lot of people coming to you. And I suppose the more active you are, and I was determined, having finally won the seat, which took 11 years of.
You had 3 goes,
effort.
didn't you?
Yeah, I won on the 3rd attempt because it was a Conservative seat with a big majority, 15,500 majority in the days when it was quite tough to overturn that.
So you chipped away at that over a decade.
I did, and that's not just turning up every 4 years and fighting an election. It is week in, week out through the year. So turning up on a wet November evening, 4 years out for an election at some public meeting in a village hall, and making yourself heard and hopefully contributing something to whatever's being discussed. So it's a hard graft on top of your legal work, because you have sort of, it was a law firm, so you had targets to meet and so forth. But in your parliamentary role, you've got desperate people often coming to see you. It might be a child with special needs who's not getting the support they need at school. It might be a child with a mental health issue that is on a year-long waiting list, and
if they're lucky these days,
if they're lucky, or and I always make the point that if you're on a waiting list with a significant mental health issue as a teenager, it's not just your health that's suffering; it's your education as well.
Absolutely.
Nobody ever thinks about that, but that's the reality. And I don't want to get the order of your podcast too muddled up, but I gained very personal knowledge of this because our oldest son Archie, diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder as a 15, 16-year-old, and when subsequently we were told it would be about, this is the thing, we were told it would be up to 6 months before he would see anyone. And for us, 6 months was wholly unacceptable. We were desperate.
Yeah, and it is.
And we just thought, how can we leave this problem unresolved for 6 months?
Yeah.
Now, of course, as you say, it could be a year, it could be much longer.
2 years. Yeah.
Yeah, which is, it's just horrific. And of course, we paid for treatment because we could afford it. And I guess any family faced with those circumstances would do that if they're able to. But most people can't. And so there's a real social justice issue there for me. How can we have the benefit of getting access to that support? I mean, it didn't help that much, but it was at least support. You felt you were doing something.
Yeah.
When other people are just left waiting interminably. And so that sort of, drove you on to develop strong views about the need for better access to support, for example. So yes, this advocacy role was very strong, both as a lawyer, then as a parliamentarian, but then, as a minister. I used to describe myself as a sort of mental health campaigner representing mental health in government, rather than a government minister sort of representing the government position to mental health. And I think on the whole, there aren't enough ministers who have that total drive. And of course, I have to accept I was lucky because I got appointed to a role that I knew by then something about, and I cared a lot about.
Yeah.
And a lot of people get shunted from one role to another. They never get into it. They're not that interested, perhaps, instinctively in what they've been appointed to, and nothing happens.
Yeah. See, I think when I met you the first time, so we this whole thing is off the table now. I think when we first met, I'd met a few politicians before, never come away feeling particularly hopeful from those meetings. And then we were at South London Maudsley, so our service had applied for this award to be a demonstration site or a centre of excellence for, for psychological care in the context of psychosis.
Yeah.
And there was this national competition, and it was really about, the Department of Health funded these centres of excellence that would then produce evidence that could inform policy.
Weren't there
And
about 6 around the country?
there were 6, yeah. 2 for psychosis, ourselves in Lancashire, plus South London, Maudsley, 2 for bipolar, and 2 for personality issues.
Yeah.
So we were all at a meeting at South London, Maudsley, when you were minister. And I think I'd been on the radio earlier to talk about early intervention in psychosis. And one of my clients, a young man and his wife and his kid, came on the radio to talk about their experiences and say, look, this is kind of life-changing stuff. You know, if we get help soon, as early as possible, people get better, it costs less, and we recover and we live a normal life. If people
Quite
wait
powerful.
it was incredibly powerful. And I remember you walked into the room and you were like, "What show? My name's Norman. How's it going?" And I'm Warren, how you doing? And he went, yeah. Have I just heard you on the radio? And I went, yeah, my client was on talking about his experiences. Oh, that was brilliant. So we got chatting, and then you're like, oh, can I come to visit and see what you do in your service? Because I care about this stuff, you know? And I remember by the time we'd finished that meeting and that we had this kind of round table thing, I went away thinking, this guy actually cares about this. We might have a chance.
I wasn't putting it on.
We might have a chance in here. You know, it occurred to us. And I think you shared at the time that you had some personal experience in your family of mental health issues. And I definitely came away feeling optimistic. And I felt a little bit differently about that meeting. And ultimately, I think that was what led to you coming to Accrington and seeing what we did.
I remember both. I mean, I remember the session at the Maudsley, and I remember then going to Accrington. And actually, it's quite interesting because at the time, there was this enormous pressure on beds. What's new?
Not enough mental health beds, not enough community support, so people end up in them.
And there were awful stories in the press about people waiting. I remember there was a teenager who was stuck in a police cell for 24 hours or something in the southwest.
Unfortunately.
And so we were reviewing the number of beds that we had in the system. And I remember getting into your car after the session in Accrington, and you were going to drive me to the station. And you said that this review you're doing, don't just focus exclusively on beds and on having more beds. And that was really the first time someone had just sort of challenged the orthodoxy for me or to me. And so that was quite an influential moment for me. And it started me on a journey, which has in turn led me to have quite radical views about how we respond to people in need, and particularly in crisis, and how shocking it is that we put people into often dismal places, always behind a locked door, whether they're a voluntary patient or detained, with very little access to the outside world, and we expect them to recover. And the idea of putting a teenager, aged perhaps 15, possibly 100 miles away from home, in a unit like that for 6-8 weeks or longer,
without seeing their family very often.
I mean, it beggars belief that the system keeps doing this.
And
so you know, your initial comment to me, and these are the moments, I guess, with ministers. I suppose it doesn't always work, but with me, that really struck a chord, and it made me think and subsequently act.
Well, I remember that moment, and I think my beliefs about it were driven by two things. That, you know, the first one was I worked at the asylum at the end of the asylum movement. So I worked at Prestwich Hospital. So my first job was in Burnley. And I was working in resettlement, so care in the community happened as a policy, and they tried to move people out of hospital who'd been there for 50 or 60 years, which on a human level was pretty poor, pretty dismal. You know, people hadn't crossed the road or bought a newspaper for 50 years, and suddenly in the middle of a city. You know? So it was really, like, on a human level, quite cruel, I think, to move people from the place where they felt safe and what they understood, and they were institutionalised. Suddenly into the centre of Manchester in a supported, you know. So that, for me, seeing what happens to people if you institutionalise them was part of my belief. But also just being responsible for CAMHS inpatient services at the time, just talking to the consultants, talking to the psychologists, the psychiatrists, the therapy staff, the nurses, the majority of children who were going into those units were not benefiting from it in any meaningful way. What they were doing was keeping them safe, but they weren't having a therapeutic experience.
But sometimes not even that.
And sometimes not even able to do that.
There are tragic cases of people who die in these units.
Completely. And self-harm. And
I also, someone else, because I'll say this, Warren, you have been influential to me in my development and my thinking. Tim Kendall, who was the National Clinical Director for Mental Health, has also been influential. And I remember him saying to me that in a so-called CAMS unit where you got a load of teenagers together, they will learn things off each other, sometimes to their detriment. And so they come out potentially in a worse position than they went in.
Yeah, and it can be a scary place. You've got lots of upset, distressed. Sometimes,
it's not a therapeutic environment.
Not usually. And I think that very often young people don't get access to the kind of therapeutic help that you would hope. And often these units are struggling with staffing. The people that work in inpatient CAMS are incredible people. I've got the utmost respect for what they do.
I agree with that.
But the national bed model, there's not enough beds nationally in terms of the need. But actually what we were talking about in that car journey was, if there was intensive and timely support in the community where we could support young people and their families early on when they needed it, so that they didn't get to a point where they weren't safe enough to be in their family home or in their community, that would be a much, much better alternative to build more beds. The trouble is, you go from that situation. I think that's what drove my thinking at the time was, if we can keep young people out of hospital, if we can support them appropriately in their home or in the community, that's a far better outcome than them going into a hospital, being safe for a few weeks and then being discharged back to the same situation.
Yeah, totally.
And actually what happens a lot of times,
because you never address the social circumstances.
Well, no. And then they come out of hospital to the same situation or worse than it was before. And then the support they've got drops off a cliff edge.
It does.
So, and they're still left with the same problems.
Yeah.
So I think there probably aren't enough beds in absolute terms for the demand we've got nationally. We haven't got enough in certain places compared to others. Some areas have got too many.
I don't agree with
that.
Enough.
Okay.
I don't agree with that. With respect.
No,
because you set me off on a road, Warren, and I'm following through the logic of this. But what I've seen is, I've visited, for example, Trieste in northern Italy, and I know we might return to this at some later
can I just
time.
qualify? My thinking was that the proportion and distribution of beds is probably not proportionate. It's probably not appropriate, but it's so much better to keep people supported in the community, and I want to come back after this to the early intervention in psychosis policy, because that was one example of doing the right thing and funding it properly.
Yeah, absolutely. What I was just going to say was, I've seen approaches elsewhere, and I was going to mention Trieste in northern Italy, where very few people go into inpatient, what we would describe as traditional inpatient units, very few. And very few people get detained. It's not unsafe. I don't think the way we currently do things is safe. I don't think it makes people safer. As you say, if they return to their same social challenges that they had before they went in, that's doing nothing to keep them safe or anyone else safe. So I think our approach fails on its own terms. And
I think we take a medical model to complex social and emotional issues.
Absolutely.
And it's inadequate. And Engels said that years ago, we need a biopsychosocial model. And we're still using a medical model to treat psychiatric problems, which are complex human issues.
Completely right. But you mentioned early intervention psychosis. A point I was going to make was that there is a great irony here, that everyone in mental health talks in terms of principle that early intervention is an effective approach, and there's evidence to back it up. But the way the system works, it delivers the latest possible intervention because you sit on a waiting list for yonks. And then it's a crisis intervention when everything's gone horribly wrong.
Yeah.
And so the system fails miserably, in my view, and is it crying out for radical change.
Yeah.
And this is, but I suppose when you have a personal tragedy, and we're one of thousands and thousands of families who've been through this, so I'm not trying to sort of claim this was exceptional, but when you have a personal tragedy, it sort of brings it into sharper focus, and it makes you realize that all the things that you've learned sort of, I suppose, intellectually, the sort of human force of that. So it's made me very driven, and I was, I argued at the Maudsley for the opportunity to trial a new model of care, a different model of care. There are now 6 trials around the country, rather like those trials.
Oh, fantastic.
So the Maudsley is one of them. We secured selection. There's another one in London. There's one in Birmingham. There's one in Cumbria.
So these are more of a therapeutic community as opposed to a psychiatric institution type model.
Yeah, and it's taking a lot of learning from Trieste.
Trieste, yeah.
At the heart of this approach, there would be what is usually called a mental health community centre, open 24/7. So you don't have to worry about getting referrals from your GP. When you need support or help or just a chat, you just go in. Yeah. And you don't wait for it. You just go in and have a chat. There are no waiting lists.
Amazing.
They spend, this is shocking, they spend a lower proportion of their health budget on mental health than we do. But I think they achieve
and their outcomes better. Yeah.
Vastly better outcomes.
Yeah.
It's a more human approach.
Yeah. It's based on relationships and sense of safety, isn't it?
Well,
rather than.
I'd love to talk to you further about this book that I've written, but at the heart of every good approach seems to be this question of relationship building. And I think one of the problems in mental health, but also actually, if you think about it, in a whole host of other public services, is that we've created a sort of culture where professionals are supposed to keep their professional distance, to not give of themselves often, and to offer nothing sort of in return in building a relationship with people. So relationships aren't built. It's a very formal...
It's transactional, isn't it?
Transactional
in many ways,
relationship between the professional on high and the recipient.
And there's a power differential too.
Totally.
Which means I'm the doctor. I've got letters before my name. You've just come in off the street.
Yeah.
I'm
listen
the one.
To me.
Listen to me. This is the way. And I think that's the problem with the medical model, is that there's this sort of, not always, but I was talking to a friend who's a medical consultant on the way here, and he's saying, you have to detach a little bit to be able to do the job, And when you think about it, when you look at the research into psychosocial interventions, it's really clear. Over 50 years, the most consistent finding is the relationship, the quality of the relationship predicts outcome to a large extent.
Right. Whichever actual therapy you're using.
Whichever therapy, but specifically in psychosis, for example, because that was my field. Richard Bentall talks about this on The Life Scientific with Jill Malkalili. Really fascinating interview if you get time to see it. But he said, we did all these studies of CBT and psychosis, and we found out that, we had some good outcomes and at least as good as drugs, if not better. But the interesting thing was we had all these really highly trained people delivering therapy, all experts in the field, all at the top of the game. And what we found was if people said their relationship with a therapist was satisfactory, they got better.
Yeah.
If people said it was kind of neutral or neither here nor there, they stayed the same.
Yeah.
And people who said the relationship wasn't satisfactory got worse, despite them seeing some of the best therapists in the country.
Yeah.
So the quality of that connection between the people, the person you're helping and you as the practitioner has a massive influence on whether someone benefits.
Totally.
And if we look back in history before modern pharmacology and laboratory developed medicines and all of this, what we had was we'd go and see a wise person or an elder in the village, and they would know us and they'd listen to us, and we'd build a relationship with them, and we'd we'd ultimately be inspired by their advice to make changes, whether it be physical health changes or relationship changes or other life changes. And that's what we had.
Yeah.
We had the relationship.
Yeah.
And like, you can call it also a placebo. You could
Yeah.
say, well, it's a placebo. They did a ritual. They listened to you.
But that does it an injustice.
It does an injustice. But that connection was all we had.
Yeah.
And today it's very much about technology and pharmacology and transactions and monitoring and assessments.
And it's, if you look at a population level, palpably it's not working.
It's not working.
But I just wanted to go back, we were talking about beds. I want to just enter a bit of a caveat to what I said. I'm not anti all beds. And sometimes I've been portrayed in that way wrongly. I remember a medical director once saying he wants to get rid of all of our beds. And, it's sort of like, that's a big criticism within the mental health world. It's the sort of bed we're talking about. I do not believe that beds in a locked setting with perhaps 18 men or women in a confined space together with virtually no access to the outside world, I defy anyone to claim that that's a therapeutic space. Now, of course, there are some environments that are better than others, and I don't want to I absolutely don't want to diminish the extraordinary work that a lot of people do despite the setting and despite the system. And there are extraordinarily dedicated people working in patient care, and I've seen them with my own eyes and heard of heroic work to keep people safe. But they're working despite, in my view, a pretty awful system. So in Trieste, in these local community centres, it's 6 dotted around, or 4, I think it is, dotted around the city. They have 6 beds. So, but, per
centre.
Per centre.
Okay.
So if you're in a feeling you're descending into a crisis, well, you can go and stay in one of those beds for a few nights, a safe place, a therapeutic place with kind people who will look after you, who will get to know you. That's a wholly different story. And if there are people who really do need to be locked up, and I appreciate that in periods of crisis, there are sometimes circumstances where people can be dangerous. So
or risk themselves more often, but sometimes
dangerous to themselves or dangerous to others.
Yeah.
And so, if someone does need to be locked up and they don't have capacity, perhaps, let's just rethink what we mean by where people then go. Can we not create a therapeutic space for that person? And work intensively with them, which doesn't happen in inpatient care generally, to help them get to a place where they'll be better able to cope with the extraordinary challenges that many people with mental ill health face in the outside world when they leave. And, in the course of writing this book, which we'll perhaps come back to at a future day.
Absolutely.
I've talked to people who, run units where people might stay for 2 or 3 weeks, not the sort of long stays that we often get here, with intense activity, with a lot of physical activity, because we know that there's a relationship between physical fitness and our health and well-being, where there, interestingly, aren't locked doors for people with psychosis, where they're kind, generous spaces where people can feel therapeutic support and benefit from the whole range of interventions, which might include music, arts, physical fitness, and so forth. So I just think for the vast majority of people, it's so much better if you can intervene early and stop the crisis from happening in the first place. If a crisis does happen, let's give them the dignity of somewhere decent to go, which might actually be therapeutic.
Well, they might actually want to go and choose, actually, I think I need some extra support at this time. I'm going to go and spend a few days here, rather than feeling, oh my God, it's going to be awful if I get admitted to hospital. I'm going to do everything I can to avoid talking to people about how I feel because I don't want to go there. So it's actually a more proactive, collaborative
and
process.
There are I've also learned that the unintended consequences of the coercive approach that we use, particularly for people who may be black, because there is clear institutional racism in the mental health system. And Sir Simon Wesley, in his introduction to his independent report on the Mental Health Act, confirms or accepts that there is institutional racism. But when you're 4 times more likely to be detained, when you're black, when you're more likely to be placed into seclusion, to be restrained. Shaney Lewis lost his life due to police prone restraint in a unit at the Maudsley in 2012. These wholly unacceptable incidents are the result of a coercive approach. But we never think that because of the experience that people have there, word gets around that you don't want to go into that place. So people aren't going to open up and tell the truth to their psychiatrist.
No.
Because they know if they tell the truth about how they may be feeling,
They might end
they're
up
going
in
to
there
get
again.
locked up.
Exactly.
So they don't have an open, full conversation.
As opposed to, I know that if I voluntarily come to this centre in Trieste, for example,
there is
I
not
will
a
have
threat.
choice.
You don't face a threat.
It will be a collaboration. I will be, And I think, just going back to the early intervention in psychosis work, for me, there were some really important reforms during that period, which you led. And I think one of the most important ones was the 2-week referral to treatment time.
Yeah.
Plus the introduction of waiting times in CAMS.
Yeah.
So that didn't exist. There was no waiting time limit or target in CAMS. And when I was responsible for children and family services with my colleagues in Lancashire, our CAMS services, I think, had roughly an 18-week waiting list, which we were pleased with. We wanted it to be better. And then the Children's Mental Health Task Force was commissioned by yourself, and that led to some really important reforms as well.
Future in Mind report.
The Future in Mind report, absolutely. And the thing that struck me was, it was really about, first of all, that task force was a very collaborative and inclusive process. That, the people that were, the stakeholders involved in that were from all walks of life, all parts of the system, multidisciplinary, multi-sector, lived experience as well, plus experts by profession. And I think it took place over like 6 to 8 months, didn't it?
Yeah, we did it in,
It was a really intensive.
I think no more than 9 months.
Yeah.
And I said at the start, I don't want this to be dominated by Whitehall. We're going to go out there and get the contributions from the whole range of people who might have a stake in this, including young people.
And then in every area, my experience of this as a professional was, in every area there was funding to make reforms in the children's health and wellbeing system based on that report. So in every area there was a Children's Mental Health Task Force implementation group where all the senior people from different parts of the system came together to implement the recommendations of that report. And I'd never seen that happen before.
No, and I'll tell you this, the sort of concept, and this came from a civil servant, not from me, but I totally endorsed it. Concept was, we've got this sum of money that we have available for these reforms, and you will get your share of the money after year 1 if you have demonstrated that you've implemented what you said you were going to do in your action plan. Now, you can create an incentive there. You're giving the rights to the locality to create their own action plan according to their needs. But all we ask of you is that you do what you say you're going to do. And if you do, we'll give you the money to support that change.
Yeah.
Now, I wanted that to continue year after year. Yeah. So you had a continuing incentive to maintain the momentum for change, and they dropped it. And I just thought, this is so typical that, once I'd gone, I had no control over it. But it was so frustrating because that was a mechanism that was working to drive change. Just very quickly, it was liberal for me, because this was not the centre imposing its will. This was the centre saying, change is needed. These are the principles that we've come up with through this collaborative process. We ask you to work out your plan to how you do it. And if you do that, we'll give you some money. And if you implement it, we'll give you more money. Yeah. But you'll have to keep showing us what more you'll do. That was the whole plan. For me, that is liberalism in government, empowering people
Yeah.
to make change.
And for me, it was the first time I ever saw such a range of stakeholders come together in a room around a set of issues. So we had head teachers, we had social care, we had police, we had NHS, we had local charities, we had sporting organisations, like sporting.
Yeah.
So we had all of these different stakeholders, and it's the first time I'd ever seen a complete, a complete kind of system represented in a room. Actually focused on delivering what were excellent recommendations produced by people who had that knowledge.
Yeah.
And then the second thing that I think was really important during that period, and actually I'll just say this, I don't know if you know this, but even after the coalition government was no more, and even after some of those policies or those mechanisms were officially abandoned, many areas carried on with their Future in Mind implementation group.
Yeah.
For years and years.
Yeah.
Because it was such an effective way of bringing system partners together. So that report was still being implemented and driving change years after you went out of government.
Yeah, I mean, it's good to hear
which
that.
is amazing.
And I think there was a perceptible shift towards sort of earlier intervention and the involvement of people beyond the mental health system critically, as you've just described. But, fundamentally, the system is still broken.
Yeah.
And the tragedy from my point of view is that was an opportunity to start a process of quite radical
Reform.
change, which could have been driven in the way I've described through incentivizing action at a local level, but not imposing it from on high.
Absolutely.
And I think it could have driven really exciting change to the benefit of very large numbers of young people.
100% agree. And I think the other thing that's lasted from that period for me was the evidence that our service in South London, Maudsley and others were generating based on that work we were doing gave you and your colleagues enough confidence to say, okay, what we need to do is, here's the evidence. If we intervene really early with people showing the first signs of psychosis or the first signs of serious mental health problems, and we assess them quickly and give them treatment and appropriate support according to their needs. And if we can do that within 2 weeks, because that's what the cutting edge evidence says, 3 months at the outset, but ideally within 2 weeks, if we can do that, we'll see people getting better. We'll see people having less duration of illness. We'll see people not going into hospital as much, and we'll see people stay better for longer and have meaningful lives.
Yeah.
So that for me is one of the few examples that remain in our mental health system and social care system where we fundamentally have followed the evidence and we've implemented policy and we've backed it up with funding, recurrent funding. And even today, however many years after your time as minister, if I walk out of here and turn up to a GP surgery and say I think I'm feeling like people are watching me and I'm starting to hear voices, within 2 weeks I should be sat in front of a team who are assessing whether I need help.
Of course.
That for me is incredible. And that is an evidence-based practice, funded appropriately, resourced appropriately. But I can't think of another one.
Well,
unfortunately.
so I mean, the fact that has persisted is in a way good news. The bad news is that when we introduced that 2-week standard for early intervention psychosis, we also published a paper from the Department of Health, which was a plan over the next few years to introduce comprehensive standards for access in mental health across the board, because the principle that applies to early interventions in psychosis applies to other areas of illness as well. And that never happened. That plan was never implemented. There've been bits and pieces, but there's never been a focus on ensuring parity for mental health, which is, we'd legislated for in the coalition, the hated coalition. We legislated for equality between physical health and mental health. And the reality is that there is not parity, and there still isn't. But I suppose as I've developed my thinking since then, I probably wouldn't any longer want a system that just relies on these sort of imposed standards from on high, because I've seen in Trieste, but also in other places, how if you rethink the approach and you say, we're not going to have a waiting list. It's a weird, radical thing to say in this country. It shouldn't be. But you can actually rethink how you behave as a sort of institution and just say, we're not going to have waiting lists. So you just come in. And there's someone I've interviewed for the book. I'm not going to give any details at the moment because it's published in August, late August. But running a service that didn't really do diagnosis, but just depended on helping people, on working together, building relationships, as you said earlier, to solve problems. And no waiting lists at all, and all age service. To me, that's sort of radical thinking.
It is pretty radical.
But the results they were getting were amazing.
I think there's models around the world where the kind of setup that you describe is incredibly effective, very humane, very collaborative, saves money. People don't go into hospital as much.
Yeah,
it's wonderful. I guess the challenge is how we get from where we are today,
totally,
with this massive weight and increased demand, struggling to get staff into jobs in mental health, struggling to recruit, but struggling to keep people in the jobs.
So what I would say is the whole system, it feels stressed. Staff, most of whom are very dedicated, trying to do the right thing, working in a completely dysfunctional system. That's my overall analysis. And I just think you have to trial a completely different approach. Now, we've started to tinker with that, with these six centres, but it's sort of 6 localities within large mental health trusts. There needs to be more bravery. We need to look at how things are done in some other places around the world and really try in a locality a full, very different system. We know that what we're doing isn't working at the moment. It's not helping people recover. It's not keeping themselves safe or others. So what is there to lose by trying something very different, more humane?
Yeah, I agree.
That actually might deliver better results for people.
And one of the other things that was in the Future in Mind report, which I advocated for quite strongly, is this idea that we would ask people routinely about what happened to them. So as part of our assessment, we would ask people, had they experienced adverse childhood experiences? Because we know in England and Wales, the cost attributed to adverse childhood experiences is something like I think exactly the paper by Mark Bellis and Karen Hughes in 2020 said £42.8 billion every year is the cost absorbed by the health system attributed to adverse childhood experiences, because we know people with more adversity in childhood have much greater risk of developing mental health problems, much higher rates of physical chronic health problems, and much higher rates of social problems like criminal justice involvement and being excluded from the education system. So part of this as well, it's a structural change and a kind of philosophical change. But I also think we have to acknowledge that a lot of mental health distress is driven by unresolved pain, unresolved trauma. And very often that originates in childhood or at some point through our early life. And I think unless we acknowledge that, unless we start to ask people about these things when they're seeking help, we'll just carry on picking up the pieces. We'll carry on treating the symptoms, but missing the cause.
I mean, to me, it's sort of, and this I suppose comes from years of thinking about it and witnessing it personally in family, but also in talking to so many people. It feels blindingly obvious to me that if you've gone through some sort of traumatic experience, it's going to have an impact.
It's going to show up,
you. And for me, the sort of acid test is, we know that when you have a recession, levels of mental health go up. That can't be anything to do with some sort of weird chemical imbalance in your brain.
No.
That is the effect of what
Stress.
you're going through.
Yeah.
If you have a pandemic, we happen to have had one of those. we know from lots of evidence that it results in higher levels of mental distress and ill health. So isn't that telling us something? Isn't it telling us that the causes are often outside us?
Yes.
Now, of course, there are genetic differences with every single human being that those outside influences are playing on. But if we ignore the outside influences, we really are being very stupid, it seems to me.
Yeah.
So I totally recognise what you're saying. You've been a leading advocate for this, and I respect you for it. And it ought to just be routine. And it's so obvious.
It's so obvious, but there are so many levels of resistance to it. And as we kind of round off, I'm conscious that time's running out. They've done this in the state of California.
Yeah.
So if you see a GP or a paediatrician in California, it's legislated. They will ask you about adversity in your history, whether you're a parent or whether you're an individual. They'll ask you, what do you know about your child's exposure to adversity? What do you know about your exposure to adversity? Have you experienced X, Y, and Z? And they found enormous benefits to that. Similar to the studies we've done of the approach that I developed called REACH, we've got lots of evidence that people appreciate being asked. If you don't ask people, they don't tell you. We then keep bouncing around the system and getting the symptoms treated, but not the underlying problem. If you ask parents about these experiences, they tend to go, oh my God, actually, I'm just repeating the things that my parents did.
Yeah.
And actually, I want better for my kids. Maybe I do need that help that you offered. You know, maybe I could do with a bit of help because I don't know what good looks like, you know? So there's so many reasons why I think it's such a powerful, simple but powerful change we can make. Conscious of time. So what I want to finish on, Norman, and ultimately we should let people know there will be a part 2 because you've written this book. What your book is called?
Be More Human.
Be More Human.
Which I hope conveys a sort of central theme.
Yes, absolutely. Really want you to come back and talk about that.
I'd love to.
In August, when you launch the book.
Yeah, end of August is...
Or sometime around then we'll talk about the book. And on a final note, I guess I'm just interested in you saying a little bit about, just briefly, why you decided to write the book and just some headlines about what we can expect.
So throughout all of these years of sort of learning, both in Parliament from, all these people as constituents who came to see me, who'd lost loved ones through suicide, who had children on awful waiting lists, a whole array of horrible circumstances, through being a minister and again hearing stories of people. And rather unusually for a minister, I would intervene in individual cases. I went to visit a teenager in St Andrew's Hospital in Northampton and saw this. I mean, she was in essentially something akin to a prison cell. So, through all these years of experience, I'd ended up with some fairly clear views about what was wrong, and not just wrong, unacceptably wrong, amounting to an enormous social injustice, in my view. And I felt that I wanted to make the case more formally for change. So I sort of had in mind this idea of writing a book. I approached a publisher just to explore the possibility, what would be involved, and they sort of liked the idea. And suddenly I was confronted by the offer of a contract before I'd really thought through the project in any detail. And so you sign up and then you think, oh my God, what have I let myself in? So converting sort of ideas in your brain into a properly thought out, properly argued case is quite a complex process.
Yes.
So it's been a fascinating experience. I'm very, very glad I've done it. And I've talked to some extraordinarily inspiring people, both a lot of people who have survived the system and really have shocking stories to tell, but also people who are doing very inspiring things, services for people that demonstrate very clearly that change is possible. I mean, that's the wonderful thing. We don't have to sort of invent a whole new approach. It's out there already across our country, but also internationally. But the central state system remains stuck in the dark ages. And that needs to change as a matter of urgent priority.
Wonderful. So when can we pre-order the book, Norman?
I think you can pre-order it possibly now. It's advertised on Amazon, so I don't know what that means, but so you can have a look.
We can pre-order it, and the publisher is.
I hope so. It's Jessica Kingsley, yeah, and there will be a launch event at the end of August.
Wonderful.
Which you'll be invited to.
Oh, thank you. I look forward to that. And are you doing an audiobook? Are you going to do it audio?
Yeah, though there is. They don't do audiobooks for all their books, but they recently told me that this one has been selected, so there will be an audiobook as well.
Well, I'll be listening to you in the car as well.
Yeah, we've got to work out whether it's an actor or me who reads it.
Can I suggest that it's you?
Well, I feel it should be me.
It should be you.
We'll have some discussion about that.
I think it should be you. Anyway, Norman, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. It's always an inspiring conversation. Well, I'm really grateful.
Well, the feeling's mutual, and I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Look forward to part 2 in due course.
Absolutely.
Cheers. Sweaty handshake at the end of this.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.